Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Jamal Abdi. I'm the president of the National Iranian American Council. I'm very pleased to have this distinguished panel with us tonight to talk about the very pressing issue of coronavirus and Iran. We are joined by some distinguished guests. We have Dr. Javad Salehi Esfahani, somebody who, I don't know about you, I have a Google alert anytime he writes anything because it's must-read material. We of course, and we have Tara Seperi Far from Human Rights Watch, who has done really laudable work on the impact of sanctions on human rights. We have our very own Sina Tusi, and I will let our moderator do the intros for all of our speakers. Let me just quickly say, I know there's a lot of issues happening right now. It really feels like we're sort of in a world historic moment. And we think that the issue of coronavirus, how the Iranian government is handling it, how U.S. sanctions may be playing an impact, we think this is an important moment among many. We will be having several other events in the near future that I hope you all sign up for. Next week, we plan to have an event with leaders, activists, and elected officials regarding the Black Lives Matter movement and looking at the issue of police reform, criminal justice reform, as well as some introspection about race and the Iranian American community. So we'll be sending out information about that. We also, later this week on Thursday, have an online event with Yasamin Ansari, who is an Iranian American running for city council in Phoenix. And we have plenty more events and programming to come. So please, if you're not already signed up for NIAC's newsletter, you can do so at our website. Now, without any further ado, let me give the floor to our moderator, Negar Mortazavi. If you don't know Negar, where have you been? Negar is an Iranian American journalist and media analyst with the independent newspaper, the BBC, and Al Jazeera. Negar has been covering Iran and U.S. foreign policy towards the region for over a decade, and she was named as one of the top 10 people to follow on Twitter for Iran news by The Guardian. So we're very thankful to have Negar tonight, and Negar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamal. I hope you have a Google alert on my name as well. And,
I'm on your Twitter.
On Twitter. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for what I think is going to be a great panel. I just want to remind you all at top, if you have questions for the panelists, you can start typing them starting right now in the Q&A window that's just below your Zoom. If you look in that section, and when we get to the Q&A section, I will start reading your questions for the panelists. Let me just introduce our distinguished panel to you and then get right to the question and answer. Dr. Javad Salehi Esfahani is a professor of economics at Virginia Tech, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, a research associate at the Middle East Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School, and a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo. He received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. Tara Seperi Far is a researcher in the Middle East and North Africa division at Human Rights Watch, where she investigates human rights abuses in Iran and Kuwait. Previously, she was deputy director of the Human Rights in Iran unit at City University, New York, where she worked to support the mandate of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran. Tara received her master's degree in international law from Tufts University. And finally, Sina Tusi is a senior research analyst at the National Iranian American Council, where he conducts research and writes on U.S.-Iran relations, Iranian politics, and the Middle East policies. Previously, he was a research specialist at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Sina's writings have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and Monitor, among others. And Sina has a master's in international relations from American University. Welcome to all the panelists. So let's start from Dr. Esfahani. Let's see if we can take a look at the current state of Iran's economy. considering a few months of coronavirus that's frankly impacted the entire world economy. Here in the US, we've seen the impacts, but how has this pandemic impacted the economy, considering also that this is combined with Iran actually as one of the very unique examples of being a country under pandemic combined with US sanctions? There's only very few countries that are dealing with these two issues simultaneously. If you can give us your take on how the current state of economy is in Iran.
Sure. I'll say a few points that perhaps are obvious, and then in the Q&A, maybe we can get into more detail. In some ways, Iran's experience with COVID is similar to most other countries in the sense that social distancing has provided the economy with a negative supply shock. Basically, people can't go to work, they can't produce, and there are other negative shocks coming from you cannot export because the borders are closed. So those are all standard stuff that's happened to all countries. Iran perhaps is different from the advanced countries from which we hear a lot more these days. And we hear less about what's going on in terms of the economic impact in poorer countries. And I think that experience is again shared by other developing countries where the informal sector is large and the government is strapped for cash, so it cannot help enterprises to stay afloat. And then if they go down, they're very hard to put them back up. In countries where all the companies are registered, for example, it's really a matter of having the cash and using the banking system to reach these enterprises. So, for example, in Europe, a lot of countries have paycheck protection programs that really will help the economies to recover. Iran has a lot of protection for income. It has income support, but nothing really like paycheck protection. So in some sense, I'm expecting a longer recession as a result of COVID for Iran than the average country, average European country, for example. The other aspect, other than employment, is people's living standards. They live in an economy that is taken two consecutive shocks. One arriving last few years, which is intensification of U.S. sanctions. Oil exports have gone down, government is poor, and there's not enough foreign exchange to import a lot of stuff. And then on top of that, you have all the stuff related to COVID, related to the pandemic. And so it's not a very pretty picture, but what is least pretty is looking at it from the point of view of the Trump administration, where all this suffering can be a good thing if people rise up, or if the economy crumbles and the regime or the government has to agree to US conditions, which everyone acknowledges are very harsh and tantamount to capitulation. So that's, I think, my introductory remarks in terms of how Iran looks under COVID and under sanctions at the time being.
Okay, great. We'll get back to that. Let's look a little bit at the political picture with Sina. If you can explain to us how the combination of this maximum pressure and now the pressure of COVID-19 has affected domestic politics, and then also especially from the viewpoint of Washington. We just heard recently President Trump, after the prisoner swap, the recent prisoner swap, saying that he wants a better deal, a new deal with Iran, encouraging Iranians basically to come back to the negotiating table before the election. What's your take on what's happening in Tehran and how Tehran views this Washington or Trump administration policy under these combined pressures?
So yeah, we saw after the prisoner exchange last week between the US and Iran that President Trump tweeted that Iran can get a bigger and better deal with him if they negotiated with the US now, and they didn't wait until after the election in the US. But in reality, we've seen that Trump's policies toward Iran, they've recreated the taboo against negotiations with the United States inside Iran. Now, this taboo, which had existed for decades, it was pretty decisively broken during the Obama-era nuclear negotiations with Iran, which were marked by many like regular bilateral and multilateral U.S.-Iran talks. Even Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif and then U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry would go on long walks together, to the constant consternation of hardliners in Iran and in the U.S. And maximum pressure and the Trump administration's kind of reneging on the nuclear deal in 2018. What this has done is really depleted and decimated the political capital of people like Rouhani and Zarif and the kind of moderate reformist faction in Iran that really staked all of their political capital in negotiations with the U.S. And we've seen that, hardliners there have been empowered. And really, since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, especially like maximum pressure and the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the political cost for anyone in Iran arguing for negotiations with the United States has dramatically escalated. And this is evident in really comparing the prisoner exchange that happened last week with the prisoner exchange that happened in December. Now, in that December exchange, which was Princeton PhD student Jiwei Wang, who was in Iran, was exchanged with Masoud Soleimani, this Iranian scientist. That December exchange was marked by Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi meeting with the State Department's Iran envoy Brian Hook in Zurich, having direct dialogue. During that time in December, Rouhani was really pushing internally for some sort of negotiations. He had a couple of speeches. One of his speeches was something like, the Prophet Muhammad negotiated with non-believers after they had reneged on earlier agreements. And he had also said that negotiations can be revolutionary. This is Rouhani was saying this in late November and December. And then after that prisoner swap happened in December, Rouhani went to Japan at the end of December. And there were many rumors at the time that, the US has greenlighted this trip to Japan, and what could come as a result of it would be a potential small deal between the US and Iran, where the US eases some sanctions, gives another waiver to countries like Japan to import some Iranian oil, and this would kind of build trust and confidence and could potentially lead to a bigger deal. But then we saw in early January, the US assassinated Qasem Soleimani, and this was really, this was Pompeo in the ear of Trump convincing him to do this. And, obviously that dramatically escalated everything. And we've seen with this current prisoner exchange that happened last week, how much things have changed. So unlike the December one, this time, Iranian officials across the board are saying, we're open to prisoner swaps, but this doesn't have to be a result of negotiations with the US. There will not be any negotiations with the US. Zarif has said this. Shamkhani, the head of the Supreme National Security Council in Iran, responded to Trump's tweet, outright rejected negotiations, said there will be no negotiations with the United States. And so we've seen that Trump, he's really, and the Iranians are saying even if there are swaps, they would happen at the consular level, that they wouldn't happen through formal negotiations. So they're playing down negotiations. So Trump, whether he knows it or not, his Iran policy is not leading him to diplomacy, it's leading him to war. And his Iran policy has really been driven by, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, before him, National Security Advisor John Bolton. And these are figures who really opposed U.S.-Iran diplomacy in principle. This is their track record. They don't support diplomacy with Iran. They support war. They both openly supported military strikes in the past. And, the kind of the hardline hawkish think tanks in D.C. that have played a massive role in kind of influencing the Trump administration's Iran policy, like the kind of hardline pro-Israel Foundation for Defense of Democracies, they've been very transparent with how this policy is really aimed at regime collapse and ruling out negotiations. And even recently, they've been trying to really get this in writing from Trump that, do not pursue negotiations, pursue regime collapse, keep maximum pressure indefinitely. And, they've had a number of reports to this end. But the fact is that this policy, however way you look at it, it's been a categorical failure. The Iranian government has not collapsed. It has not capitulated to these kind of maximalist, untenable US demands. It's expanded its nuclear program. There's been all these counter escalations by Iran in the region. The US and Iran have almost gone to war multiple times in the past year. The Iranian people really are just suffering, and they're getting increasingly impoverished as a result of this policy. And I think, someone like Pompeo right now, he is very desperate right now. This policy has not worked. He's been in Trump's ear about this, and he has nothing to show for it. And right now, 6 months before the election, you can see that he's taking these increasingly desperate moves to kill the Iran nuclear deal. So at least by the end of Trump's first term, And if Trump leaves office, these hardliners in the US could at least have achieved that. So we've seen that just like 2 weeks ago, they revoked these nuclear waivers that were part of the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And these nuclear waivers were a critical non-proliferation aspect of the nuclear deal in that they allowed work by the Russians, Chinese, and British to reconfigure Iran's nuclear facilities to make them less able to build nuclear weapons. So now we've revoked this waiver, enabling this kind of work to be done. In effect, trying to egg Iran on to leave the deal and move towards expanding its nuclear program. So, because then we would enter the cycle of escalation that Pompeo and them want. And at the same time, Pompeo has right now, and we can maybe talk about this more later, but he has this ruse kind of to use the excuse of this expiring UN arms embargo against Iran to reinstate UN sanctions against Iran. So that's another desperate move and to kind of really escalate things. But so another point I just want to quickly touch on is that in terms of the increasing political costs for negotiations with Iran, with the United States inside Iran, the new parliament is very significant. This parliament was elected in February. Its election was marked by the lowest turnout in any election in the Islamic Republic's history. The Guardian Council disqualified many incumbents and reformists and moderate candidates. But nonetheless, right now in Iran, we have a situation where President Rouhani's former rivals in the 2017 presidential election, Ebrahim Raisi and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, right now they're heading the two other branches of the Iranian government. So Raisi is the judiciary chief, Ghalibaf is the parliamentary chief. And in the parliament right now, you really have three kind of conservative factions. You have this more hardline fundamentalist faction that's aligned with this Jebhe Paidari group in Iran that are a lot of former Ahmadinejad officials, and they are really extreme radicals. And then you have Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who the majority of MPs supported to become parliamentary speaker. And then you have the kind of traditional conservatives who are led by this person who was a former official under Rafsanjani. But Ghalibaf himself, he has a record of kind of being more pragmatic on many issues and kind of being a technocrat. He has a long history of being a kind of an official in the Islamic Republic. He was a military commander during the Iran-Iraq War. He joined the Iran-Iraq War as a 19-year-old, fought throughout the war. He became an IRGC commander during the war. After the war, he kind of headed the IRGC's reconstruction arm. He headed the IRGC's Air Force. Then he was the national police chief for several years, and then he was Tehran's mayor. So he has this reputation during this tenure, especially as mayor of Tehran, of being technocratic, but he also has a lot of corruption scandals. And he also has, this background as kind of also being more ideological and extremist, in that a couple of years ago, this video surfaced of him talking to kind of some I believe it was like Basiji students. And he was saying how during the 1999 student protest, he himself took a baton and went to the streets to like beat up people. So he's also, he has this kind of mentality as well. But regardless, Ghalibaf, so the conservative parliament right now, I think the one thing they can really unite on, because conservatives in Iran often they can't agree on a common platform. There is kind of a lot of divisions between them as well. But right now, these different factions, one thing I think they can unite on is the opposing Rouhani vociferously in his last year as president. And Ghalibaf, in his first address as parliamentary speaker, he made this clear. In his address, he really strongly criticized the Rouhani administration, and he also ruled out negotiations with the United States. And he said that negotiations with the U.S. are useless and harmful, and our policy with the U.S. would be to complete the vengeance for Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated. So this just shows the domestic context in Iran as a result of maximum pressure and the increased political cost for negotiations with the U.S. And this is the situation that we're really faced with for the next year.
Okay, hold that thought, and later if you can also talk about a potential Biden presidency and a second term of Trump and how Tehran would view that. But speaking of the judiciary, that's actually giving us a good bridge into human rights. Tara, if you can speak of some of the more pressing issues. We know that Iran has been dealing with a few crises in the past few months, some even before COVID-19 started, and then all of this is adding a layer to it. What are some of the more important issues that are, affecting civil and human rights on the ground? If you see any prospects for change in any of those areas, and if you can also explain how the pandemic has affected the overall situation of human rights.
Sure. Borrowing from an article that Dr. Saleh Esfahani wrote in the beginning of the pandemic and rephrasing it, so he doesn't have to take responsibility for me rephrasing it. COVID-19 hit Iran at one of the worst time in terms of economic impact that has been explained and will be explained further, but also in terms of the level of public trust, general public trust in government ability to handle this crisis in terms of accountability, transparency, and generally being open to public. As you mentioned, over the past 6 months, six to 8 months, there have been several crises, human rights crises in Iran. The most important one was the widespread protest that happened in November 2019, and it was brutally repressed by security forces. And I will explain the aftermath of that. And then it was the shooting of a civilian airliner with 176 passengers in the aftermath of response to the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, and then it was the outbreak of the virus. So it was kind of a roller coaster for the Iranian society, going through these very highs and very lows of crisis. And I think to this day, the problem of accountability and truth for what went wrong lingers very strongly in demands that are mentioned by the Iranian civil society inside the country. The attention of the government, the press, the news cycle has shifted very, very quickly, but nevertheless, the accountability, the question of what happened and why it happened remain very, very important at the top of the demands. Interestingly enough, right after the protests broke out in the U.S. and we saw many videos of police use of excessive force on TVs across the world, the Iranian government decided to announce the total number of deaths that they had collected. For several months, they were saying that they have the list, they're going to announce it, but for various reasons, they were not even announcing a number. And I think they kind of used the opportunity to throw out at least a number. We still don't know the names. We still don't know if there has been any measure that resembles accountability in terms of investigating allegations of excessive use of force. According to them, 231 people have been killed. And while the Iranian government argues that there were arms outside the use of armed forces, and they have accepted responsibility that some innocent people have been killed in the protest. Nevertheless, there has been zero measures of accountability. So I think accountability seems to be a theme that keeps repeating, because I also have to mention, it's not new. All impunity has been a serious impediment to reform and prospect of reforming in Iran for decades. I think the COVID-19 also in Iran, like many other countries, exposed some of the pre-existing problems with governance and exacerbated some of the existing disparities or problems that they were dealing with them. I think we probably will talk about the impact of sanctions on Iranian government to mobilize resources at some point. But generally, the problem of being able to quickly mobilize resources at their disposal, communicate clearly, use the networks, civil society networks to provide relief and help, isn't something that the Iranian government and authorities are used to. And in fact, they rather not. So for several weeks, it appeared that officials didn't exactly know what the plan was, and they were going back and forth. And from there, the relief packages they've provided, small economic stimulus packages they've provided, seem to be really just allowing the same structure that existed. an example of potential for exacerbating some of the disparities along a socioeconomic line is, for example, the efforts they took on providing online education to kids when schools were closed. They launched an application to provide online education for children who couldn't go to school, but that required access to smartphone, tablets, and most importantly, internet. So while urban middle class, urban upper middle class either had children in those families either had already access to devices or could at least use their family's devices to receive educational material, children in poor families in more marginalized areas of the country did not have access to, did not own devices or did not have access to internet, proper high-speed internet to even receive there. So this is an example of something that in the long run will probably just exacerbate the disparity in education and quality of education that already exists after many years of privatization of education, and at least difference in quality of education. And I think one more issue that has been in the debate, and again, I think it's very interesting to note that Iranian public is actually very sensitive to human violations of human rights in terms of reacting and discussing. So almost all the topics I'm talking about are being actively discussed in papers inside the country as well. It's not something that is what we have been discussing. If you open papers, if you follow the social media accounts of people who are working in Iran, these are the issues that they care about. It's been the topic of violence against women and violence against children. Just a matter of 10 days ago, there was a very sad case of an honor killing of a 13-year-old girl by her father, which kind of reignited a decades-long debate about inadequate protection in Iranian law for children and for women, and more than a decade-long effort by different lawmakers to embark on some sort of minimal reforms. And I can go more into detail about why some of these structural problems exist, but to just make the long story short, the tragic death of this girl kind of did the last push for passing a law that was 11 years in the making to increase protection for children and adolescents in Iran. And while the law is not nearly sufficient, it doesn't go nearly far enough to solve many of the structural problems. For the first time, there's a law that protects children under the age 18, and there are some provisions including preventing access to education by parents that is considered an abusive condition. So while the challenges are I think serious, the ability to embark on reform is limited because of the political dynamic that Sina laid out. It is very clear that the society demands reform, and even in this suboptimal or broken structure of elected and non-elected forces, where Rouhani is left with zero social capital and is actually not even a serious player in the discussion, there is still active conversation about the need for change of attitude with regards to many human rights violations. The prospect of it doesn't seem very bright because of the parliament, because of how we're going. But I think one thing we can say is that the demands are still very much there and are explicitly discussed.
Okay, great, thank you. And we should definitely later discuss the impact of sanctions on everything that you discussed. So going back to Javad, and I'm also looking at some of the questions, and I'll soon be taking questions from the audience. But if you can also elaborate on basically the view from Washington. So Donald Trump reimposed sanctions when he pulled out of the Iran deal, the JCPOA 2 years ago, and started this policy of maximum pressure on Iran. And it seems like the administration's hope was that these sanctions would bring some kind of an economic collapse on Iran, which we haven't seen yet. But now with the pandemic and everything that you talked about as far as the state of the economy, do you think that kind of a collapse would come? And if not, basically this maximum resistance that Iranians are talking about, how has Iran been able to resist the maximum pressure, and for how long will they be able to continue? Will they be able to resist another 4 years of Trump and maximum pressure if, let's say, this administration stays?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the Trump administration was optimistic about two things. One, that Iran's economy was very fragile because it depended so much on oil. Once you cut off oil exports, everything would kind of crumble. And the second thing, they underestimated the level of social protection that the revolutionary Islamic government has put in place in the last 40 years. Cash transfers, income support, Comité Emdad. So these two, if they had known Iran better, they might have been more careful. As you know, they rushed to get out of JCPOA. There were people who were saying, let's go back to the UN. If you're unhappy with their missile program, we can have the snapback mechanism to take care of the JCPOA. And I think rumor is that John Bolton was saying they're going to be gone in 3 months. We don't need to bother going back to the UN. Now, actually, they're trying to go back to the UN to do what they should have done or what they could have done over 2 years ago. So on the economy, where they made a big mistake was they did not recognize that Iran's economy is not resilient because the government is so good, but because by happenstance, it has adopted market style policies that makes the economy more flexible, not necessarily resilient. I'll give you an example. Iran does not do what Venezuela does, which is when their foreign exchange revenues go down, they impose price control, including fixing the price of foreign exchange, generate a lot of capital flows, corruption, and so on. What they do is they allow the exchange rate to fall, which has a dramatic effect. And people here in the US cheer that, thinking that that's really a sign of collapse. But in fact, it's true that when the real collapses, prices go up. But when prices go up, there's not just one effect. It's not just like people are having a harder time buying stuff. It also means that producers inside Iran now can make more money by producing those things and selling them. What happens immediately after a devaluation is that price of imports double or triple. And consumers switch from imported goods to domestic goods. I credit that to the fact that although level of income in Iran has gone down, employment has gone up. Just last year, winter quarter to winter quarter, was 500,000 jobs added to U.S. economy. This is between 2019, 2020 winter quarters. So that's a big error on their part. And so it's not so much like there's a resistance economy that's in place, that's well thought out and so on. It basically says that most economies are resilient. When you allow prices to function, resources can move around. Resources can move around from sectors that are sanctioned to sectors that are not sanctioned, and so on. And the second point is about social protection, which we can talk about more. And I think that's one of the distinguishing factors of Iran. This is a purposeful thing, unlike the market flexibility that Iran's economy has social protection was part of the revolutionary promise. And although Iran has a very unequal society, unequal inequality of income. Why? Because they adopted market-related policies. People can become billionaires, and there's no check on that. And there's no progressive income tax that takes care of that, like in European countries, Northern European countries. But instead, it's taking care of the bottom of the distribution. So there's a lot of inequality, especially at the very top. They're super rich, but the government has a mechanism to reach the poor. And I would credit the much maligned former president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad with bringing two programs that are now really helping Iran. Number one is the cash transfer program, where millions of Iranians, practically 75 million Iranians, got bank accounts into which the government can immediately deposit money. It's completely automatic, does not require any kind of a application or intermediaries. If Rouhani decides to put more money in people's accounts, tomorrow they can go take it out, right? So, and in fact, Rouhani last November topped up that amount of money that had declined over time because of inflation. And now it's about $25 in purchasing power parity. It's very important to not use the free market exchange rate when you try to understand Iranian living standards, because Iranians don't shop in Rome. They shop in small towns and they buy stuff at Iranian prices. And what the World Bank does is create an exchange rate that equates the purchasing power of the rial in Iran with the dollar in US. So if you do that, $25 per person per month is not bad. It prevents extreme poverty. In addition, they thought they would let everyone to cash in on that. So you could actually collect as much as $330 PPP by borrowing against this stream of income, this stream of cash transfers. You see, they're doing all they can. They put in a one-time shot of about $300. And then finally, the second program that's really important, is just coming online, is this justice shares. 49 million Iranians were given shares to public enterprises owned by the government, not by the foundations, but by the government. And as of a couple of months ago, they have been able to decide whether they want to sell those shares and use the money, or whether they want to own this share and get the dividend on it. And about a third have opted to cash those. If you cash that amount, it's as much as maybe $5,000, the value of those shares. So you can imagine there is a big windfall that can protect a lot of people, at least for another year, if they decide to sell the shares. So I would say the social protection system in Iran, including the health system that's relatively socialized, most people have health insurance, is the backbone of Iran's resistance, both to COVID and to the sanctions.
Great. You actually kind of answered a question we had from Stuart Freeman on income inequality. And let's move to a question from Mariam Shahidi. Sina, this one is for you. She says, it seems that the Trump administration simultaneously adding to sanctions and urging Iran to negotiate with this administration. And how do you see the international community abiding by these new sanctions? And I also want you to talk about the snapback and basically the Trump administration now suddenly pretending that they're still part of the JCPOA, even though they left the JCPOA. And how do you think that is going to play out at the UN Security Council in the upcoming months?
Yeah, so great question. So first off, the Trump administration is very isolated on its Iran policy on the world stage. We've seen that, their only real allies on this policy are Netanyahu's government in Israel and the Emiratis and the Saudis, and even the Emiratis have kind of hedged their bets as of last summer when Iran began kind of counter-escalating in the Persian Gulf, and the Saudis as well have kind of shifted just a little bit in negotiations in Yemen. But despite all this international isolation, the Trump administration, right now, all the sanctions that they've imposed on Iran are unilateral U.S. sanctions. They're not United Nations sanctions. So right now they've gone across the world and they're threatening all these countries who are doing business with Iran. And they're saying, if you guys don't stop doing business with Iran, we're going to sanction you. You have to choose between doing business with the US or doing business with Iran. So they threatened and scared the rest of the world against the wishes of all these countries to cut their trade with Iran. And they've been successful in that. But despite that, Iran has managed, to at least continue trading with it in the region and with many of its neighbors. And like Dr. Saleh Esfahani said, its economy is afloat. And so, but the Trump administration, they want to escalate things further right now by trying to reinstate UN sanctions against Iran. And their ruse to do this is the Iran nuclear deal. It was endorsed by UN Security Council resolution, the UN Security Council 2231 in 2015. And this resolution mandated kind of supporting the deal and lifting sanctions. And the Trump administration, reneged on the deal in 2018 and has been violating this resolution, obviously, and violating the Iran nuclear deal. But nevertheless, and Iran actually remained in the nuclear deal for 1 year after Trump and them reneged on it and tried to get the Europeans and other countries to abide by their commitments and keep the deal afloat. And even now, Iran has kind of ceased compliance with aspects of the deal, but it said if the US and other parties go to full compliance, Iran will go to full compliance. But so this UN Security Council resolution 2231, it has a provision called snapback. And this provision could be triggered by any of the JCPOA participants. So that'd be, countries like the US, if it were a participant, and the Europeans or Russia, China, that if like Iran was not abiding by its commitments, they can reimpose all of the UN sanctions against Iran. And now, so the Trump administration, their ruse right now is UN Security Council 2231, which endorsed the nuclear deal. It also said that the UN arms embargo against Iran will expire in October of this year. So the Trump administration right now is saying, we want to prevent the arms embargo from expiring, and we're going to introduce a resolution to prevent this from expiring. Now, if Russia and them have said they would oppose this and they were going to veto that resolution, and the US has said, if the Russians veto this, we're going to claim that we are a JCPOA participant. We're still a participant in the nuclear deal against all logic, against all kind of in every bad faith measure, in a total immoral way, and say we are a JCPOA participant and we are entitled to trigger snapback as per UN Security Council 2231, which the US has violated. And in that way, they would reimpose all UN sanctions against Iran. So this is, in terms of whether the Trump administration will be successful with this, it really is uncharted territory. It's going to set up a very ugly fight at the UN Security Council. And I think the Trump administration, we've seen that President Trump, they've had this kind of might is right approach to international relations. They've had this very unilateral approach. They're trying to take down all these multilateral institutions. And I think ultimately what they're trying to do with snapback at the UN, if they're successful, they're going to undermine the UN Security Council process. We're going to be set up with a scenario, if they're successful in reimposing UN Security Council sanctions, that many countries are not going to abide by them. Russia, even Europe, they might not abide by them. Russia and China might sell Iran arms in spite of this. And what this does is undermine the entire UN Security Council process. And I think that is an aim of these kind of unilateralists like Pompeo and Trump. They view the UN Security Council as this multilateral globalist institution, as restraining them, and they want to kind of really, they abide by the law of the jungle. It's the same Pompeo who has it out for the ICC, who has it out for the same Trump administration that has it out for the WHO. They don't care about the UN. So I think what's important right now is that the Europeans, all these different countries that have a vested interest, the American people who have benefited so much with the UN, and ultimately many of these multilateral institutions were set up after World War II by the US, and the US has benefited the most. The US veto on the UN Security Council has helped the US a lot on its interests. And for the UN to kind of get weakened, or all these multilateral institutions to get weakened, it would ultimately be not in the interest of the United States. So I think, we need to sit there. This is going to play out very ugly in the UN Security Council, but I think the rest of the world has a strong interest in kind of keeping this institution alive and imposing these machinations. But it is uncharted territory, so we'll have to see what happens with snapback this fall.
Okay, great. And also speaking of snapback and sanctions, let's go back to Tara. Tara, you had this excellent report last year where you researched and published about the impact of U.S. sanctions on health and specifically shortage of certain medicine in Iran. And now we know with the COVID-19, there's also the issue of medical supplies and not just drugs. I've done some reporting on that. There's been some more, but I know this is something you follow closely. If you can tell us more about the impact of U.S. sanctions on, Iran human rights, specifically the right to health, and especially under this pandemic on the ground in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, the starting premise of the research was the United States government's claim that because there are humanitarian exemptions in the sanction regime that have been imposed on Iran, they are not responsible for any negative impact sanction may have on the rights of economic, social, cultural rights of Iranian people. And the research we looked at basically how, despite these exemptions that exist in the text of the law, the combined effect of these sanctions, and they come in many forms. Some of them are nuclear related, increasingly they are counterterrorism related, plus the political messaging that is coming from the highest authorities, the president himself and the State Department and Treasury, is restricting Iranians' access to certain medication. At the time, we didn't conclude that there was an acute shortage of access to basic medicine, because actually over the many years of sanctions, Iranians have tried to move away from import, and they are actually very quick in trying to reverse engineer drugs as much as they can. There's not such a thing as a patent law per se in Iran. So there is actually, not only there's not a law, there's actually a national urgent policy to try to get to become independent of import in all areas as quickly as possible. And that comes with some side effects and potential negative impact on people's health as well. But while Iranians produce more than 90% of their medication domestically, some of the rare and specialized medicine that are needed for certain diseases, we found that patients had problems. I think what COVID showed, and what basically COVID led to having this conversation more broadly at the international level by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, several other UN officials and different countries, is that at the time that a country needs to mobilize all resources at their disposal, sanction regulations can be very, very limiting. I think there was a case of Iran, for example, trying to buy certain testing kits from South Korea, and that was rejected. I think the SWIFT mechanism didn't accept the transaction, and there was some back and forth. And increasingly, you've seen different humanitarian mechanisms being established to do humanitarian trade with Iran, which I think shows the structural problems that exist with the sanctions. So again, I think speaking to many of the people who are working on the ground, for them, the way they explain it, and I think they're right, is that sanctions exacerbate the competency problems that the Iranian government has in responding to the crisis. Iran was one of the first countries that was hit outside China. So I think there was a very focused lens on different failures or perceived failures of Iranian government, or lack of mobilization to act quickly. But then as the virus spread across the world, similar patterns started emerging in various governments across the world, and that debate dissolved as kind of a broader conversation on where governments are falling behind on responding. But the reality is that the government was limited in terms of quickly mobilizing resources. the Iranian healthcare system has suffered in terms of access to medical equipment, high-tech medical equipment for hospitals, has suffered under sanctions, because the price of medical equipment has increased exponentially, and the government allocating resources to most needed equipments that need to be imported by the government regulated exchange rate doesn't necessarily apply to a broad range of medical equipment. So there are hospitals that it takes longer for hospitals that get equipment they need, and it's much more expensive. But I think the other argument that was used by Iranian officials, it was said that it was like the resources at their disposal to support people through the period of an enforced quarantine was very limited. And I think that's an argument that it could be better discussed by people who are more familiar with the economy. But the reality was that the amount of available cash for them to support people through, for example, a period of 2-month mandated quarantine was very limited. So I think it's important to talk about it. But the way Iranian doctors explain it to me is that it doesn't have to be what is the root causes of the problem. Is it sanction or mismanagement? I don't think we need to look at it that way. And unfortunately the debate by those who tend to recommend these sanctions becomes very polarized, in the sense that it's either or. The reality is that there are many structural problems in Iranian economy. There is systematic corruption that actually has expanded under sanction, but as a policy measure, these are impacting Iranians' access to health, and some of these technical solutions, such as establishing a humanitarian channel, can reduce the negative impact. But the reality is that what is needed is the political will to not use maximum harm inflated on people as a policy tool, and that doesn't seem to necessarily exist at all levels of U.S. government. There were even debates that U.S. officials were looking at the pandemic as an opportunity to inflate even more harm on Iran, and that's the exact wrong attitude you need to have in a global pandemic.
I think we have time for maybe one round of questions from each of you. So going back to Jawad, and I'm going to combine 2 questions for you. There's one from an anonymous attendee asking you whether Iran, he says Iran has had US sanctions for over 40 years. Will any snapback, what Sina was discussing, any snapback change anything? This is one question. And then another question also for you from Omid Madani. He says, could the goal of the US be simply to keep Iran weak, not growing economically, and in check, not necessarily collapse? In that sense, hasn't the goal been achieved and basically been successful so far?
Yeah, those are 2 very good questions. The first question about the snapback. If U.S. is able to bring back the UN sanctions in a manner that other U.S. members accept, yes, it would have an impact, because right now, if you try to get away from sanctions, you're breaking only U.S. law. You are not breaking United Nations laws. More and more countries are going to be mindful of stepping over UN sanctions than US sanctions. So I think that is an important thing. And as Sina was saying, it's not clear that they can have this clean snapback, which they could have had, by the way, 2 years ago, because now it's not clear they are a member of the JCPOA, so that they can bring back the whole group to agree to UN sanctions. It will not affect the economy all that much, however, because the most serious sanctions is the US monopoly over global financial mechanism that prevents Iran from moving money around. So I talked about the reduction in the or the increase in the price of imports, the switch from imports to domestic production. The most important part of that is exporting to other countries where you can create jobs, because now your goods are much cheaper, you can outbid a lot of countries and so on. Now Iranian workers probably have a lower wage than average Chinese worker. So if Iran was able to get the access to global financial mechanism, it could go a long way with its resilience by shifting resources and exporting. But unfortunately, because US has so much control over that financial system, that's not going to happen. But UN will not add a whole lot to that part. The second question, I'm very sympathetic to that. I wrote here a very cryptic note. Can you remind me again of the question of gentleman Omid?
The second question
I think I remember.
is, could the goal just to be
Yeah,
to weaken and keep in check instead of collapse?
Right, I'm very sympathetic to that. I really think that the more benevolent interpretation of what the US is doing is not that they were not reading Iran's economy well and made a mistake and so on. Maybe some people in the Trump administration did it, but the more sophisticated people who see an Iran that's muddling through, that is in always financial trouble, is less of a threat to Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that makes a lot of sense to me. What is missing, however, in that argument is that there's another Iran that is possible, not as certain, just possible. An Iran where the private sector already has a very big role in the economy in Iran. I think people make a huge mistake when they think the country is run by mullahs and IRGC operatives. No country is that simple to be run by just a few people. You need a lot of people who run the gas network, clean water network, electricity network, companies, food on supermarkets. Iran has a very complex economy, and in that, the private sector is a very important part, and everybody in Iran, including the supreme leader, including the IRGC, recognized that. And when the COVID struck, they again recognized the health professionals that are doing a lot of work. The question is, are they willing to share power with these people to allow civil society composed of private sector, all sorts of professionals working in Iran, to have a voice in how Iran is governed? I'm not sure about that, but sanctions make it a lot harder for this transformation to take place. So yes, an Iran that is in economic trouble will be less of a threat perhaps to Israel and Saudi Arabia, but there's a much better story, and that of an Iran that's an example of how to use global markets, how to allow the professional class, the middle class that has risen in Iran, to slowly move into sharing power with the revolutionary government. And I know that that is hard for people who've been bombarded with all these stories of the cabal in Iran that's running and torturing his own people and stealing their money. It's hard to imagine that. But people who do travel to Iran, they see this vibrancy inside Iran. And I think a more enlightened policy from the United States would be to go for this much, much better scenario of having Iran that emerges in 10 years, perhaps, at par with Turkey, as a country with more liberal attitudes, with more engagement with the global economy, and a support for fighting terrorism as opposed to in participating in it.
Okay, great. So speaking of a weak Iran, let's also talk about regime change. Sina, I want you to answer a question. There's an anonymous attendee who's asking to discuss the role of the Iranian diaspora and groups in encouraging regime changers in the US administration. And also if you can elaborate on open talks of regime change among some lobby groups here in Washington. We're seeing more op-eds visibly talking about regime change. And basically it's something that's a parallel, considering that the president, Donald Trump himself, has said that he doesn't want regime change. And just recently he talked about negotiations. How do you see all of this playing out in Washington, and also the role of the diaspora?
I'll just say, to keep it short as well, the pathway to peaceful democratic change in Iran, as Dr. Saleh Esfahani was saying, in terms of the role that U.S. could play, is not in terms of sanctioning the country to hell, impoverishing the people, destroying the middle class, empowering the worst elements in Iran's system, perennially marginalizing and isolating the economy. It's through sensible diplomatic engagement, empowering, trying to integrate Iran into the global economy. This is a model that was never really tested. Even after JCPOA, just for like a year or two, it was kind of being implemented, and even then it wasn't ideal. And even then there was kind of strides in this direction. But so I think, unfortunately, this policy that we're seeing enacted now, spearheaded by people like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, who believes in the rapture, and this far right evangelical Tea Party, a kind of former Kansas congressman, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed in Emirates, Netanyahu in Israel. These people, I do not think, want to see a strong, prosperous, democratic Iran. For them, Iran is a strategic rival, 80 million people, arguably Islamic Republic or no. It's this rival that they would prefer, that maybe in their, I think it's a misperception, but they feel like if Iran's ties with the international community and with the U.S. and the West improved, it would come at their expense. And I think this is at the root of why they oppose the nuclear deal, because they don't want Iran's ties with the West to improve. So I think, unfortunately, we see in parts of the Iranian diaspora, and I don't want to, I think that it's a loud minority who have really strongly aligned with themselves with this policy. I think it just, personally, as an Iranian American, I think that US-led regime change in Iran is not the path to peaceful democratic change, and certainly not the way we've been seeing it enacted by someone like Trump, who's destroying democracy in America, I would argue, personally. And so unfortunately, this is just really leading to a more destructive direction for the Iranian people, and to be allowed ourselves and our community to be co-opted by these these extremist actors in American politics and in the region, who don't really want positive things, for the Iranian people or elsewhere. That this is just a disservice to really just stability and kind of prosperity everywhere.
Okay, and finally, Tara, the last question is for you. It's from the Quincy Institute. It's a long question. I'll paraphrase and then I'll add a question from myself, asking about how some Iranian human rights defenders in the U.S. were seeing, they're expressing some kind of support for repression of protesters here in the U.S. or, in any way, police brutality, somehow siding with opposite the protesters in the U.S., but then at the same time, Iranian government officials expressing sympathy with U.S. protesters, some kind of a double standard. And then finally, the question is, what do human rights defenders in Iran expect from the Iranian diaspora here? And if you can also add to what Sina was talking about, this whole talk of regime change in Washington and the maximum pressure policy, how that has affected the human rights defenders that are working on the ground in Iran.
Yeah, I think the first part of the question is probably very simple, and it's one word: hypocrisy. I think Iranian government, as well as many other repressive governments around the world, are definitely using horrific videos of police brutality and excessive use of force against protesters to basically justify a race to the bottom, saying that a country that has taken upon itself to promote human rights as part of its foreign policy is openly using tear gas against its protesters, using helicopter as an intimidation tactic against peaceful protesters. Basically, it serves their own narrative. I think with the Iranian government, it's pretty simple. I think while international solidarity is an important part of human rights advocacy, I think Iranian government use of those footages is more reconstructing the narrative that they need for their own interpretation of the world order as they propagate. Similarly, I think if you're a human rights defender and then your perception of power relationship and changes when the power changes, then you have to go back and look into your own principle. Human rights framework, just very briefly, is a body of internationally recognized laws and that governments voluntarily accepted after the World War II and agreed to treat their citizens in a certain way because of the horrific crimes committed during that period. So selective application of these norms in different places is not necessarily doing human rights activism, doing political activism. And it's actually very common, goes beyond the Iranian community. And aligned with that, I think many opposition groups inside and outside, particularly outside Iran, inside the US, use human rights arguments for their claim. I want to be very clear, many of them have been victims of repression themselves and their families in Iran, and they continue to be harassed in Iran. So the responsibility of those violations are solely on the Iranian government. But I think and it's not limited to Iranian or Iranian American human rights defenders. It includes many of the people who are openly advocating for conflict and war with Iran as well. Instrumentalizing human rights to justify some of these policies is basically just feeding the narrative of power in Iran that human rights at the end of the day is about change, is about regime change. And that does come at a cost that makes reform very costly, makes activism very dangerous for people on the ground. And at the end of the day, they are the people who are going to pay the price. Again, it includes freedom of expression. People can expose themselves. And I think some of the ones who have actually tried to justify Trump government policies against protesters have gotten the pushback from the community. So it's good that these are being openly discussed. But I think it just contributes to this narrative that that human rights is being used as a pretext for a regime change policy, which shouldn't be the case. And I think U.S. selective approach in this context is reinforcing that narrative. The United States government decided to leave the Human Rights Council, one of the most important tools the country can have to create international mobilization against human rights violations in various countries, and UN has been very critical of Iran's record on human rights. So seeing that hypocrisy, either it's happening by the Iranian government or by the United States government or people who are taking side, is not that difficult. I think Iranian audience is very smart. And the last part of the question, what Iranian human rights defenders expect, I think is that increasingly enough, it has been very difficult for them to have a voice at the international scene and have a seat at the table, not necessarily with specific treaty, but generally being heard without all the filters that have been placed on their voice, including many of us who ultimately end up being the ones that are reflecting the voice. First and foremost, it is because of the harassment and repression in Iran that people who speak out risk getting arrested. But also there are many forms of power relationship that people tend to represent views of 80 million people by looking at a very narrow segment of the society. So I think the first and foremost demand that I hear from human rights defenders is to be able to have this bridge between inside and outside the country, is so that their voice could be elevated, their demands could be elevated, and could be mobilized in a direction that will ultimately benefit the people of Iran, as opposed to it being used necessarily for certain political agendas inside and outside the country. There are tools at the disposal of people who live outside the country for accountability, and could, if used in the right direction, can ultimately put Iran on the right path. But instrumentalizing, weaponizing, and politicizing some of these ultimately bring back the price on the back of the activists who are the ones doing the work on the ground.
Great. So on that note, I think it's time to end the panel. We went a few minutes over. I thank you all for staying these extra time. We still have some questions from the audience. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to answer all of them. I encourage everyone to reach out to the panelists They all write, they speak, and to follow their material more. I thank you again, Tara Saberifar from Human Rights Watch, Sina Tusi from the National Iranian American Council, and Javad Salehi Esfahani, economist at Virginia Tech. And thanks to the National Iranian American Council for hosting this. And this was also simultaneously live broadcast on YouTube, and that link will also be available for watching again for those who have missed it, and it will be shared on NIAC's website and Twitter and Facebook pages. So look out for that. And thank you to all, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nagar.